Welcome, everyone. We are so glad you could be here today. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Yeah, thumbs up. I'm Brenda Zook Friesen, and I'm a trainer with Roots of Justice. Some of you know we've been hosting the Racism is Real dialogue series addressing a range of topics. And today's topic is moving from Karin to committed. We'll be introducing today's panel here shortly, but first we wanted to address the elephant in the Zoom. See what I did there? See, this is serious, but we can have fun with this. Joy is resistance. So why would we host an event for white female identified people? Doesn't that center whiteness the very thing we don't want to do? We should be amplifying Black and Indigenous and people of color voices, not white voices. Well, if you've ever been part of a Roots of Justice training or event, you know that racial caucusing is an integral part of our work. Racial caucusing is an integral practice for most anti-racism collectives where people of color meet together in one space and white people meet together in another space. And you may be here because you've heard people of color saying that we as white people need to do our own work and that we need to work with our own people. Caucusing is one way to do that. As white people, we're socialized to think of ourselves as individuals. In mainstream life, we rarely, if ever, think of ourselves as being part of a white collective. And caucusing provides a space for us to better understand what being part of this white collective means within a racist system. We often are more comfortable looking at how racism hurts people of color, and we very much need to address that oppression and violence. It's much harder for us, though, as white people, and uncomfortable for us to learn about and understand how we perpetuate racism, how we benefit from white supremacy, how we are complicit in the oppression of people of color. And caucusing, when it's done well, can provide a supportive space for us to look in the mirror and to hold the mirror for each other. It can provide a space where we learn together without burdening people of color or expecting people of color to field our frankly elementary questions about race and racism, or to listen to us defend and rationalize why we said and did the racist thing we did. For those of us who identify as female, white supremacy and racism manifest in specific ways. And you would think as people who experience sexism that we would be natural allies to other women of color, and yet. So we caucus together to better understand our whiteness and our racism so that we can return to multiracial collectives and know how to not center ourselves, how to learn from the times when our white supremacy spills out, because it will, and how to do better next time, how to follow the lead and direction of people of color, how to be accountable to people of color in this work. Caucusing can't just be navel gazing or dead-end book clubs. Caucusing should lead us to clearer understanding, action, and accountability. We recognize in this current moment that we need time and space to caucus, but how do we do that in the age of COVID? So this is a new experience for us, hosting a caucus-type conversation virtually. And we're all a bit apprehensive about how this will go, but we hope it can serve as a support for all of us here and be one element of our racial justice work. Tammerie will be sharing more about what to expect from this space, but first we want to introduce ourselves briefly and give you quick snapshots of why we're here. So Tammerie, pass it over to you.
Thanks, Brenda. So we're doing introductions first. Yeah. My name is Tammerie Day, and I live on land that is occupied from its original inhabitants, the Occaneechi Band of the Saponi tribe. And I'm also learning to say that I live in a watershed. I live in the Eno River watershed, and this area is also known as Hillsborough, North Carolina. The places where I am most active in terms of my anti-racism work are in my job at UNC Hospitals as a chaplain educator, and also in the organization that accredits us, ACPE, and also in the denomination that I belong to and that credentials me for the work I do as a chaplain educator, the Alliance of Baptists. So that's my short intro.
And who are you passing it to?
Carol.
Okay, thanks, Tammerie. I am Carole Collins. I live, I'm also learning to do this. I live on land that belonged to the Lenape tribe, otherwise known as Manhattan in New York. I live in the Croton watershed, and I do most of my anti-racism work with the denomination that Tammerie referred to. I am co-director of the Alliance of Baptists, and we have made it our focus in the last few years to dismantle racism within. So that's required a lot of work. I also do work at the church in Manhattan I attend, Metro Baptist Church. And I will pass it to Dee Dee.
Thank you, Carol. My name's Dee Dee. My pronouns are she and hers, and I live on the Lenni Lenape land in the Delaware watershed, which is also known as Philadelphia. And I grew up in the Congaree watershed, the South Carolina Low Country. So I've always, since I was very young, been unsettled and wrestling with race and racial norms. And I do my work. I'm a writer. I've been part of the Other Side magazine. Some of you may know it, and also worked with The Simple Way and Shane Claiborne. And now I'm working with most of my anti-racism work at the moment is with a large nonprofit here in Philadelphia that is working, a whole team of people are working on how to increase, on the DEI changes needed to just be more inclusive as an organization, which is very committed to being anti-racist, but still has to do structural change. And I'm passing it on to Karin.
Hi, I'm Karin Kauffman Wall. I use the pronouns she, her, hers. I live on the traditional lands of the Kaw Nation, also known as the Kanza, from which our state gets its name. Also traditional lands of the Osage and the Wichita, and numerous other tribes within the state boundaries as they currently lie. I live in the Sand Creek watershed, which is a part of the Little Arkansas River watershed. So here where I live, it's called Newton, Kansas, where my partner and I are raising 2 kids, one of the jobs I consider to be one of my most important roles in life. And during my daytime, I work for Mennonite Central Committee in the Central States region, doing peace and justice education work. And I'm also very passionate about a community organization that I'm a part of called Newton Community for Racial Justice. I'm glad to be here, and I pass to Brenda.
Thanks, Karin. As I said, I'm Brenda Zook Friesen. I am a trainer with Roots of Justice who's hosting this event and have been working with Roots of Justice since 1999. It sounds like a long time, and it's been a long time. I'm very clear that I got involved in anti-racism work by accident, because when I graduated from college, I signed up to do a volunteer term with Mennonite Central Committee, and I had a degree in social work. There was an opening in New Orleans at the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, which is one of the longest standing anti-racism training and organizations in the US. And I naively thought, well, I had a few classes on race. I could do that. And signed up and arrived there in the People's Institute and started working and volunteering with them. And when I went through my first training, it literally felt like someone took my world and turned it upside down and shook it all up, and everything just went to pieces. Everything that I understood to be true about myself, about my faith, about my country, about racism, all of that was challenged. And I knew very early on that if I was serious about this, if I was serious about being part of dismantling racism, that would be lifelong work. And while I was working there in New Orleans, I learned of the initiative that was starting in the Mennonite Church, Damascus Road, and ended up moving back east, primarily to get involved with Damascus Road, which is now called Roots of Justice. And in the most recent years, in my full-time work, I am working with an organization that looks at women's leadership. And I've gotten very curious about this question, exactly what we're here tonight. Like, for me as a white woman, for my other white sisters, like, why do we not collaborate more? Why is there not connection with other women of color? And just really feel committed to looking at that, because I feel like we're at a point in our history. This is a moment where I strongly believe women need to lead, and women of color, we need to be following the leadership of women of color into this next era. So I am so grateful to be here. Tammerie, do you want to kick us off then, as far as, or not kick us off, we're already kicked off. Do you want to share more of what our expectations are for today?
Sure. Well, we wanted to be clear about our intentions in hosting this, and Brenda's already begun to speak to that in terms of, you know, why white people are talking about white people stuff instead of centering and lifting up the voices of people of color. As white women, we've all been helped by someone along the way, and so we want to continue that helping process. There have been so many people who've been helpful to each one of us in our own learning about racism and white supremacy. And one of the things that most of us on this call have learned and heard is that white people need to be doing our work with white people. And so a caucus call like this is one way of doing that. It's weird to be doing it in a Zoom call like this because it just asks for performativity instead of the vulnerability that we would like to all be reaching for. And so we're all just acknowledging, yep, that's a hard part of doing the thing we're doing and doing it this way. And we wouldn't be doing this hard thing if we didn't think it was worth it. So we're hoping that it is. We're not promising something life-changing. That would be up to you and your communities. And we wish you the best with that. And we want to be here for it with you. But we're not experts. Dee Dee gave us this great language about, you know, we're all defectors. And I love that language. We're defectors from a culture that is still surrounding us, still flowing through us, still drawing us in, still recruiting us all the time, every day. And so just recognizing that white supremacist thinking and feeling and being is happening, and that it expresses in particular ways for female-bodied and female-identified people. And so we want to grapple with that some on this call. And just recognize that we all need to get more curious about that intersection of whiteness and being female identified, and how that is a particular container for white supremacy. We're going to be maybe learning some things in this call, and learning is painful. There is no way that learning is not painful. This is something that I talk about with my students as a chaplain educator all the time. Learning is painful because it involves loss. We lose who we thought we were, how we thought we were, why we thought we were. We lose how we thought the world was. And that's a loss that right now everybody is going through around the entire globe. COVID has opened that up in a particular way with particular impacts for communities of color. And then these murders fell into our open space to notice, to grieve, to be enraged about. And so this is a space where there are particular pains. So I want to normalize the hurt of learning. I don't want to normalize the hurt that racism and white supremacy bring. We're learning particular things about how toxic whiteness can be, and that's painful. And we may be feeling that pain during this call and after this call, and we may be feeling other things too. We might be feeling anger, rage about what racism and white supremacy do to Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And we also may be, as we're waking up to the reality of deaths of people of color and lives cut short, we may also be feeling guilt, shame, in addition to anger and rage. We might be feeling frustration in addition to grief. And I want to invite us to pay attention to what happens with those feelings. Do they connect us to each other, more deeply to ourselves and the people around us, and particularly to following the lead of Black, Indigenous, and people of color? Or do they take us into a cul-de-sac of self-centeredness? And if that's the case, you're normal. I want to invite you just to keep that energy moving of how you're feeling and what you're noticing about your feelings, and just let your energy go into that cul-de-sac and come right back out again, back into the work. All that means is that you're normal. Move toward the work and toward the workers. And finally, I want to make a promise to you that all is not loss. Loss is not the only thing that happens with learning. But in fact, in this work, what I have learned after a couple of decades at it is that there is an almost, for white people, unimaginable life of joy and connection and community and justice, and it is waiting for you. And so my hope is that this call is part of your journey toward that justice, toward that joy. And our next thing that we want to share with you a little bit about is brief history. And I'm going to toss the ball over to Carole for that.
Thank you, Tammerie. Yes, as we look forward, we also need to look at where we're coming from, some perspective about how we got here. If we don't know our history, we're bound to keep repeating some of the same racist patterns. Collectively, white women have had a history of not showing up for women of color. Notice that I said collectively. I'm not speaking to any one individual. I'm speaking to white women as a group. This goes back hundreds of years to the beginnings of this country, when white women, along with their families, stole land from indigenous peoples, forced indigenous children into dehumanizing boarding schools, and allowed genocide of indigenous tribes. White women collectively stood by as their churches said all of these actions were destined by God. White women continue to be complicit and perpetuate racism through the institution of enslaving African people. White women watched as Black women were separated from their children and collectively did not do anything. White women turned a blind eye to their husbands raping enslaved African women. White women lived in houses built by enslaved Africans and enjoyed the profits and luxuries afforded by unpaid labor of enslaved Africans. There's an excruciating number, a countless number of times when white women aligned with the power of white men at the exclusion of all others. One potent example is from February 3rd, 1870, when men of all races were given the right to vote and white women were enraged. Susan B. Anthony said, "I will cut off this right arm of mine before I will ask for the ballot for the Negro and not for the woman." Prior to the ratification of the 15th Amendment, which gave the right to vote to men of all races, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had championed equality for Black Americans. But when Black men were given a right that white women were not, white women were furious. White women suffragists began pushing harder for the right for white women to vote, to the exclusion of Black, Indigenous, people of color women. Women's suffrage groups aligned with Democrats who supported slavery. And soon white women voting was seen as strengthening white power. And then we gained the right to vote in 1920. At a clear point in history when white women had the power to stand in solidarity with other women of color, collectively, we chose white power and privilege instead. It wasn't until 1965 that Black women achieved the same rights. The divide between white women and women of color has to continue to grow until today. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are in our history books as helping women get the vote, even though it was just white women. And those two women will soon be on the $10 bill. Black women like Shirley Chisholm and Fannie Lou Hamer, who led the work to achieve voting rights for Black women, are rarely mentioned. This is just one of the stories of the relationships between white women and Black, Indigenous, people of color women. But it stands out to me, and it speaks a lot to where we are today. But I believe that this shows well the power struggle that white women have felt. Looking back at our history is gut-wrenching for me. But we can't fool ourselves into thinking that this is a thing of the past. We can look to modern day examples like women's marches across the country, examples where white women missed key opportunities to listen and follow the leadership of women of color. White women, collectively, were so consumed with our narrow agendas and so used to taking charge that when we were challenged by women of color, our white fragility took the main stage. In our present day, with so many powerful organizing efforts happening in Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, many led by women of color, where do we stand? How will we respond to the opportunities before us to choose solidarity and accountability and following Black, Indigenous, people of color leadership instead of siding with white power and privilege? Awareness of our past and learning from our collective mistakes is the first step to ensuring a better future for all women. We are here because we want to be a part of that future.
Thanks, Carole. So the panel is going to address a few questions that we thought would be valuable to look at. But you all are more than welcome to submit questions as well. If you're on a computer, if you move your mouse along over your screen, you'll see at the bottom there's a Q&A icon where you can submit questions. And if you're on a mobile device, just tap your device, and depending what you're on, root around and you'll find that feature. But definitely feel free to submit us questions. I'm going to turn it over to our token Karin, who spells her name differently. So I think that makes you a good Karin. No, I'm just kidding. But to address this term of Karin head on, since that's part of what we had in our title.
Sure. Yeah, it's a pleasure these days to be named Karin. I know I'm not the only one on this call, so I know I have company. So why this title about moving from Karin to committed? Well, Karin has become this generic name to represent middle-aged white women. It's usually women with multiple kids who are always asking for the manager and generally acting rude and very entitled in public. Her defining characteristics are entitlement, selfishness, and a desire to complain. Karin demands that the world exists according to her standards with little regard for others, and she is willing to risk or demean others to achieve her ends. It's not unlike, if any of you remember the way the name Becky was popularized in the 1990s with Baby Got Back. And she sort of represented the white girl who loves Starbucks and Uggs and is totally clueless about racial and social issues. But I think that Karin is actually a more grown-up version of Becky that is not actually clueless about racial and social issues. But in fact, she uses her privilege to threaten and to try to intimidate Black people, especially Black men, often by calling the police. Many of us are familiar now with the example of the recent video footage of Amy Cooper calling the police on Christian Cooper, who was bird watching in Central Park, and they had an encounter involving her unleashed dog. And it's clear when you watch the video that she is weaponizing racial power dynamics as she tells the police, I'm going to tell them that there's an African American man threatening my life. She really puts emphasis on it because she knows what she's doing. Like a true Karen, she sees herself like an extension of the police. So it seems that this name, Karen, has come to represent all of the worst that Black, Indigenous people of color experience from white women, everything from microaggressions all the way to what has now become lethal threats. I don't know who I'm throwing to.
Well, we wanted to talk a little bit about why this concept has so much resonance with Black, Indigenous people of color and so much resistance from white women. And what does this Karen concept tell us about our role as white women working for racial justice? So anyone feel free to jump in on that. Karen, you already touched on some of that.
I think for me, what I feel coming up inside when I think about being called a name like that is a couple of things. One, angry that somebody's calling me a name. Like I feel like I'm being insulted and I'm being misseen, misrecognized, mislabeled, misnamed, mistreated. I'm being profiled. And as I reflect on kind of beyond my own experience, thinking about myself as a class of, I hope I'm still considered middle-aged white women. I'm thinking about what Ibram Kendi writes about in terms of why people aren't used to thinking of ourselves as members of a group. We still live into the enculturation and the myth of individuality. And so I'm not a Karen, I'm Tammerie. And of course I'm not those things. So just resistance to being treated as part of a class, part of a group, part of a race. So I think that's part of it. Kind of the myth of individuality is living in me that makes me want to resist being tagged in that way.
I think also women, we who are privileged and entitled don't want to see our privilege, so we don't want to have a name that calls it out, so to speak. That's a very hard thing for privileged people to say. And sometimes in my life, my children have called me Karen. And so as a longtime justice seeker, I know this side of me that can feel a sense of justice go, but that justice that I'm talking about has like a two-edged sword. It's a little bit of entitlement to be heard with a struggle for justice. It's an interesting contradiction and balance to try to keep. So I want to say that because here we are in a circle of people looking for justice, and among justice seekers, that dynamic can rise up.
So much of the joy that Tammerie talks about seems to me to be a place where we can all be together in community. And as you all have already pointed out, being as individualistic as white women are, or at least I am, it's hard to imagine that that community is a good idea. It's hard to imagine that working this to achieve that is going to be better than what I have.
I've been thinking about, you brought up Amy Cooper, and I think part of what we can trick ourselves into believing is that, we are the good white people who are working for racial justice, and we would never ever do that. But you can tell in that video that, for better or worse, Amy Cooper feels she's in a life-threatening situation. And what spills out is the stuff that we're all indoctrinated with, that we're all saturated in. And so one thing I would want to encourage all of us who are here wanting to work at this is it's helpful for me to always include myself in the we and not try to, you know, always, whenever thinking of these concepts or whenever talking about them, include myself in that and be very clear I am part of a collective. And when I go out there with my multiple kids at the soccer games, like, people who don't know me could very well assume I am a Karen, and I probably have moments when I'm a Karen. So just really trying to own that as well and be clear about what can spill out. One of the things that we know spills out with those Karen moments is this whole idea of white fragility, which is getting a lot of, you know, people are throwing that around in a lot of mainstream circles right now with the assumption that everybody knows what that means. Dee Dee, do you want to share a little more of?
I'll just give a little primer for anyone on the call who may not be as familiar. It's a term that was coined by Robin DiAngelo, who's a diversity trainer for many decades. And it's also the title of her probably most well-known book. And it's trying to spotlight how people who are socialized as whites in a white supremacist society, so like us, ourselves, uphold the system by making very predictable choices within it, and the intense pressure that comes not to break ranks. Of course, race is socially constructed. However, even though it is constructed by us for some of us, or for all of us, but in different order, it's so powerful. It determines how long we live, where we go to school, who our friends and partners are, where we live, what our career is, how much money we're going to make. Practically every important thing in our lives is determined by this invented social structure. And no one talks about that or the fact that it's invented. So keeping racism in place requires a huge and silent ideology around whiteness and the superiority that the culture gives whiteness. So when we talk about race as white people, it's a common conversation for any person of color. It's extremely stressful for those of us who pass or identify as white. And this leads to a lot of behaviors that DiAngelo terms in a whole big bucket as fragility. I know that's not a word some people resonate with, but the manifestations of that can be silence, or the fear of big thing, the fear of saying something wrong, tears, guilt, anger, shame, extreme defensiveness. I've had all of these and more. Rationalizations or more and more explanations of what we really meant. And the voyeuristic impulse to listen because I don't know what to say, and look on as if nothing in the conversation is about us and we have nothing to do with it, as if we have nothing to do with race. So the list can go on. And one other significant point is, and it's very important, I think, in race work, it's part of white supremacy narrative, I think, in fact, to tell us that racists are bad people like the KKK. And since we are trying to be good, look, we showed up for this webinar, we're missing our dinner, who knows what we've given up. It's almost impossible to claim the term as racist for ourselves or to acknowledge our socialization into race. And so what happens is white fragility and all those reactions that I name effectively short circuit any kind of meaningful conversation about race, and it becomes like an emotional whirlpool as a person who's white is grappling with feeling bad or misunderstood or defensive. And therefore, that kind of emotional response means we don't have a good and deep and learning conversation. We don't have a meaningful conversation. So that functions to keep any discussion within the white community involving white people at a fairly remedial level, and to keep white supremacy in place. So as we do any kind of race work, white fragility is going to show up in many ways. And I think we should embrace it. It's a sign of movement. We're moving. It's something to be moved toward. We will make many mistakes because we're actually trying to grasp a whole new set of lenses that we've never been given. We're trying to shift our entire perspective from white-centric. And that is a beautiful and joyous kind of work. And it will, I just want to underscore, it will involve real emotions. My tears in those moments have been so wrenching and real to me. But the effect of that reaction on the entire conversation is something that we have to have responsibility for and own. So that's my little summary. And I think one of our goals, as kind of, we are not experts here, would be to talk a bit or share a little bit about white fragility, how we've experienced it, how we've overcome it, and our insights on it. So I just said a lot, and I'm kicking it to any of y'all. Oh, step up, you quiet, silent, white, fragile people. No, I'm kidding.
I will step up. I feel very white and fragile today. I can give a real live example from the last 24 hours. I am co-leading a a book study here at Metro. And last night was our second night. And my white self can come up with all kinds of excuses. So I can tell you all kinds of reasons that this happened. But what happened was a person joined the call very, very late. And as we were leaving, he said, hold on. He wanted to read a poem that he had written. And the poem was very much about none of us are white. There is different tones in all of our skins, and we just need to like each other. And I froze, and the other two pastors on the call froze. And now today, I have been haunted all day about what my next steps are. What should they have been last night? I struggle with, there was a run of show, if you will. There was a specific time that I was to talk. There was a specific time when the other person was to talk, because that's the way white people set stuff up, right? There's an agenda and you follow this. So when this happened, I didn't have the baton. But today, all day long, I'm saying I should have taken it. I should have grabbed it. I should have done anything than let the people of color on the call leave that call without knowing that I understood. So I'm hoping to do better. I've done a lot of crying. I didn't sleep well. It is real for all of us. And the other question that we were asking each other is, what tools and practices help us? And as I have struggled through today, I've had several people from the study approach me and tell me they felt the same way. We've done a little bit of talking about what to do next, but what I find is the solidarity of other people in this work who have experienced it. You're one of them, Dee Dee. You said you've had tears and the tears took you to better places. So that's my real live example of white fragility as it's happening to me today.
Well, I always say, I don't want to speak on top. I just want to say one quick thing. We wanted to keep it moving in terms of space. I just wanted to say, I try to look at it on, we're going to make 1,000 mistakes. So just get on to the next one. Like, do the work you need to do to re-listen, to repair. And this is how we're going to learn. Just get on to the next one. That's how I feel.
One of the experiences I've had with white fragility that I've learned the most from happened a few years ago when I was asked to lead a 3-hour kind of preliminary workshop in a large gathering, and it was on the topic of racism and white supremacy, and I didn't want to do it alone as a white person. And so I reached out to a colleague of color and asked them to participate, and then I didn't hear back for a little while, and I panicked. And so I reached out to another person because going to keep that schedule, right? Staying on white people time. And so I heard back from the second person and we kind of started planning, and then I heard from the first person. And then I had a conversation with that person, and I ended up having to say, you know, I've already begun planning with someone else. And it was so clear in that moment how bad I had screwed up. And in fact, I lost a relationship that was really important to me, even as I acknowledged that I knew that what I had done was, I'm not going to use that word, but I'm thinking it. Very painful. Tears, guilt, shame, all the feelings. And I've tried to really learn something from it about my way of being in the world, and the being part of this work that precedes my doing has been really important for me to pay attention to. And, you know, decolonization is a $10 word, but it is a great bucket of things to think about, because I have an internalized colonist spirit, right, being from Texas. And so realizing that I need to not turn people of color into things for my use, for utilization, right? To not think about my relationships with people of color in that way. And I'm ashamed to admit that I have, and I have. That's real. To not take others, to not take from others, to not take them for granted, to not take from them, is a colonist, you know, colonial kind of way of being. And that's also something that I've worked to uproot. And it can still be in there because I have a strong task orientation. To continue to recommit to following the lead of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And, you know, these 3 words, Brenda will grin because this goes way back. There's 3 words that I learned a long time ago that helped me in this work, and that's to listen and to wait and to trust. And when I don't do those things, I get in trouble. And so, you know, I recommit to that all the time, to listen longer and wait longer, and trust that the leadership of people of color is going to come, and that I can trust that leadership and I can follow. So still painful. Still miss my friend. And I'm trying to do justice to what happened by learning from it seriously.
I'll chime in one more bit about D'Angelo's work. I mean, it's not perfect. I know there are critiques of it, but I think, our white supremacy culture tells us that if it's not perfect, we reject it. But I think that there's something that we can learn from it regardless. And I think to just emphasize that one of the things that I find really helpful about her work is talking about what happens when you mess up, because we're going to mess up, because we're alive, because we're human beings. And if we're not messing up, we're probably not really fully engaging. I mean, we're probably just playing it so safe that we're on the perimeter, or we're just, you know, watching or something like that. And when you mess up, and if you're lucky enough to have a Black, Indigenous person of color in your life that will call you on it and will tell you, and you might have to be a little bit quiet. It might not come out as strong as you need it to be in order to hear it. But to, you know, in those moments, and I will just say for myself, I know that my hands start to sweat, my heart starts to race, my face feels flushed, everything feels sped up inside of me, like I have a real strong physical reaction, and I could cry at the drop of a hat. And I know that that's what my body wants to do. But I think her advice is so helpful, is just to take a moment, and all you have to say is, thank you. And that alone is such a huge step forward in a way of encountering those kinds of times when we mess up, because we're going to mess up. We mess up every day. I mess up every day. And you have to develop that sort of rebound. You know, how are you going to pick yourself back up again and get some resiliency for this work, because it's not easy.
Anna is asking, any chance you'll be touching on white women in tears? I'm totally a crier and have been shedding tears recently, but know that tears from white women can be frustrating to people of color. So before we leave this idea of white fragility, I want to confess I'm a crier too. I mean, I feel things deeply. It's my first reaction. I cry easily. And it was really helpful to me as I was getting involved in the work. That was my knee-jerk response. I would burst into, it's like I couldn't even control it, like you were saying, Karin, just the visceral reaction. And as I learned that how detracting that could be and what a defense it could be and a distraction, I shifted into this place of, I'm not going to cry. I'm not going to cry no matter what. I am not going to be the white woman who's crying in this room, you know, like, and I shut that stuff down. I was not going to be the crying white woman, to the point that then I think we can too easily shift into just an intellectual exercise, and we shut those feelings down. So what has been really helpful to me is having caucus spaces like this and having other white people that I'm in relationship with who are also on this journey, that, you know, it's not that we're never to cry. Hopefully, hopefully you will cry. You will feel the tremendous and deep pain of what is happening. It's just when we use those tears to distract from the work and distract from what people of color are trying to tell us. So hopefully that's helpful. It has been helpful to me to know that there are spaces where white tears are welcome. And another mentor had said to me at a different point, you know, it's not that you can't ever cry in mixed spaces. When somebody is sharing a really painful painful experience, it is human to cry. Let us know you're human. So just being careful about, what are we crying about? Where is this leading? Where, you know, so hopefully that's helpful too. And Anna, hopefully that's helpful. I get you. I know about the crying. There's so much we could say. I know there's more we could say on that. But also aware of the time. Oh my gosh, we're at 4:48 already. Y'all, what are we gonna do? We had other questions here. So if participants, if you have,
All right.
oh good, glad that was helpful, Anna. If you have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat, in the Q&A. What if we, could you all share what it means to you to be a white ally or accomplice for racial justice?
I'll start because our time is tight. I'm just jumping in the space. I would like to. For me, it's meant a lot of defection from white-centered spaces, because that's where I learn and can observe, and I have not lived in a white-centered space, meaning a neighborhood or context, except I have a white family. My husband's white, our kids are white, but within that, since I was 20 maybe, so that's 4 decades, hate to say it, but I'm just learning so much every day about myself as a white person. That's been a big part. And also being willing to be kind of I heard the phrase coined, a race traitor. And I kind of know that feeling, not in a proud way, just like you do feel like you're betraying a norm, often feel like you're betraying a norm.
I'll jump into just briefly this work. Since I first heard the words frighteningly late in life, anti-racism in the late 90s, has been the focus of, I think, just central in my every expression of my values and my spirituality and everything that's important to me. And the way that I think about it is twofold. One, I feel like it's absolutely my responsibility to do everything I can to stop the way racism and white supremacy take the lives of people of color and abridge the lives of people of color, all the things. And right alongside that, and not taking the place of it and not becoming central, but constantly there, is recovering and helping other white people recover our full humanity from the way white supremacy has cut us off from our own lives, from our own feelings, and from our own awareness through those feelings, what is most important to us. And those lines from that Ella Baker spoke, about, until the killing of Black women's sons is as important as the killing of white women's sons, we who believe in freedom cannot rest. I mean, that's it. And so, I have this image of the way the overseer functioned on a plantation to protect the white owners from the cost of the way the plantation ran on the bodies of the enslaved people. And what is it in me that functions as that overseer, that cuts me off from seeing the impact of whiteness and white supremacy on Black bodies and Black lives and people of color. You know, I need to see it, I need to feel it, I need to be motivated, I need to have the rage that I feel turn into action, and I need all of that to be the spine in my soul, and that's what it feels like to me.
So I am newer to this work than the other panelists, so being an ally or an accomplice, but I have done some reading, and somewhere I read that an ally is a Karin who makes a personal project of other people's oppression. So goes to the soup kitchen and helps hand out soup. And not that that's not what I want to be. I do want to do that sometime. But then the next, the definition of the word accomplice is the person who's doing the work personally, the person who wants to help take down the structures. And I thought, well, that's it. That's who I want to be. So I have learned what I want to be, and now I am working to get there.
Wow, you guys, I love your answers. I would just say that, yeah, for me, it's a combination of you know, this is what this conversation that we're having now is what I would call doing the work, right? For understanding whiteness and the way that systems of domination have shaped our world since the doctrine of discovery and before, and the way it continues to, you know, the way we've been socialized into this, and to have a clearer understanding of ourselves and the way we function in that, so that when we're in spaces where we can stand up to disrupt that we're prepared and we understand why we're doing that. And so it's a combination of that internal and external work. And I think we can't really separate the two. Yeah, I was going to say something else, but it must have been a lie.
You're too funny. I echo everything you all shared. I think the only thing I would add, I was thinking, is this idea of risk, and that if we're too comfortable as allies, accomplices, whatever you want to call it, we're probably not truly in action and not truly part of dismantling the system. And, you know, when I first heard that idea, I think we think risk with a capital R, but it's very much a muscle I feel I need to build. So maybe it is, I am going to risk speaking up in this situation. And I love, if anyone has seen the Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes video that Jane Elliott did, which if you haven't seen that, I recommend Googling it. But there's one student, and I'm blanking on his name, I think it's Bobby, but he resists the whole experiment. He resists this idea that he's superior somehow. And he can't even articulate why. He's what, in 3rd or 4th grade, you know, he can't even say why, but he knows something is wrong. And I just hold on to that. Like, an ally can, or accomplice can be as simple as saying, something isn't right here. I don't know what it is, but I'm going to speak up, and I'm just going to name that something doesn't feel right. I don't have to be perfectly articulate and spell out a whole analysis, but if I at least can start interrupting racism and start naming it where I see it, then I build up that muscle, and then I learn next time, okay, this is what I'll say next time, because I wish I would have said that this time, you know, and you just keep building that up. But it does require risk. We don't get to do this comfortably. We don't get to do it perfectly. And dare I say, for those of us who have been socialized as white women, perfectionism is that ever elusive goal. And so we can easily spend so much of our lives having a lot of control and doing a lot of preparation and planning and making sure everything is, you know, the T's are dotted and the I's, no, I's are dotted, T's are crossed. And what I find most disorienting about anti-racism work is my rules and my orienting don't work. And so it's crazy uncomfortable. Tammerie, say it.
Brenda, don't forget, we don't get to do this politely all the time.
Amen.
Socialized as women.
So
I remember what I was going to say.
Don't say it. It wasn't a lie.
It wasn't a lie. It wasn't a lie. It was real. I was going to say, you know, in my context, I mean, I'm in Newton, Kansas, about 20,000 people. You know, this work looks different in different contexts. And for me, relationships is so fundamental in how we do this work. And sometimes that's the biggest risk we can take, is in relationships with family or friends or people that we're close to, but we cannot underestimate the value of asking a good question, a well-timed good question, or just putting a thought out that challenges the direction of the conversation, or sometimes digging deeper when you can tell that somebody wants to go there. I think that is fundamental to the work. It's not only about trying to stop traffic on an interstate. It's about that relational work too.
And several people are asking about like talking with other white people in our lives. If it's okay, somehow we're at 4:57. I'll briefly mention, for those of you who are not familiar with Showing Up for Racial Justice, it's a national network of chapters specifically for white people working with other white people. One of the core values of SURGE is calling in versus calling out, which I think, you know, Karin, that's what you're speaking to, that it is a lot of times much easier to call out other white people when we see the racism, but how, you know, it's on us. This is our work to do. How do we call in those other white people? So we got to a lot of the questions, and Phil, who's running our admin, thank you for answering some of them by text too. In the last few moments we have, right now, we're all in a global pandemic, and there has been lots of speculation that that's why we as white people are awake to this moment and awake to the racism. Eventually, hopefully, we'll be getting back to our jobs. If we have kids, they'll be getting back to activities. Life will carry on. We'll get busy. How do you all, knowing that this really is long-term systemic work, how do you all keep that commitment and stay sustained for the long haul?
Well, as working in the hospital, COVID has not taken me out of circulation, so to speak. And this is a couple of decades into the work for me, and the things that sustain me are spiritual practices and embodied practices, staying connected to my body through exercise and noticing how I feel, and being in nature, finding joy everywhere I can, super important, and trying to stay connected to other people journeying alongside, and just knowing that for the rest of my life, I'm just going to be holding this candle out in front of me, and some people are going to be drawn to it and some people are not, and it's going to burn and the wax is going to drip. It's going to be hot. My hand's going to hurt, and I'm just going to keep holding the candle because that's it. This is what it is. This is the work.
I think it's very important to remember where we're going. We're going toward a space where race has lost its power, and that it's very beautiful when we're able to experience peer relationships that feel authentic and honest, and we can really join together. And I have had those moments in my life, and I have those people in my life, and that gives me when I'm in a space where I feel that at last, not that my whiteness falls, but I feel like, oh, I'm in that space of race has lost its power and here we are. I would do anything to get back there. That's what this work is. That's what we're giving our children. That's what we're giving our communities. It's possible, and we need to do as much work as we can to get there.
That is beautifully said, Dee Dee. That when the race loses its power, I'm going to use that tomorrow. Thank you. It is the same for me. It's what Tammerie talked about early in the call, the glimpses of joy, the relationships that I have built, and the glimpses of joy that come from what relationships can be and what some of them are sometimes, and what we as humanity can be when we build a culture of diverse voices.
I know we're past time. I first just want to say thank you, Carole and Tammerie and Karin and Dee Dee, for jumping in so wholeheartedly. Hopefully everyone felt our our openness in this weird virtual space. There were several questions about, you know, how to create these kind of caucus groups or caucus kind of conversations. I would encourage everyone, if you're not already familiar with Showing Up for Racial Justice, to check that out. We know there's a wide range of experiences with Surge, but that would be one place to start, especially if there's a chapter where you are. And if there's not, I'd encourage you to start one. It's not rocket science, you know, the main things are a commitment to each other, and Surge provides guidelines for how to set up a chapter and being accountable to people of color in that process. I'm also in the chat posting, the 5 of us put together a resource list of sorts that we hope will support you in your next steps, is just things that we have found especially helpful. And we will be, for everybody who registered and everybody who's here on the call, we will be sending out a recording for this. Thanks for all the comments in the chat too, that this has been helpful. That was our hope. You'll see on that resource list that we are asking that you donate. We put our money where our mouth is, right? We can talk all we want about how we care about racial justice, and we didn't even touch on reparations. But one thing that we would really strongly encourage you to do is make donations and support the work of women of color, especially who are teaching and leading, and many doing that voluntarily. So we want to support that in real ways. And if you felt this time was worthwhile, if you want to make a donation for the cost of a latte, $5 more, whatever, you can make a donation to Roots of Justice. I'll put that in the chat as well. We'll be having another event next Thursday, which will be with a panel of historians talking about the history of race next July. It is July, next Thursday. So if you're following our Facebook page, you can get details about that. There was one more thing I was going to say about, I don't know, it must have been a lie. I'm going to use that, Karin. I know we didn't get to all the questions, but we are over. Any last words any of you want to say?
When race has lost its power.
Yeah.
Can I take that with
That's
me?
it.
Dee Dee?
Yeah, that's the quote from this.
Thank you all so much. Thanks everybody who was here.
Thanks, Brenda. Thanks all the participants.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Come and go with me to that land where I